science produces a form of evidence that no other knowledge system does.
Welcome to the Global Network for Science and Diplomacy podcast. I'm your host, and today I am delighted to welcome Sir Peter Gluckman, President of the International Science Council and former Chief Science Advisor to the Prime Minister of New Zealand. Sir Peter, it is a great pleasure to have you with us today.
Happy to help.
You began your career in medicine and over time became one of the world's leading voices at the science policy interface. From where you stand today, what do you see as the biggest challenge in ensuring that science meaningfully informs policymaking, especially in an increasingly complex global context?
Most of us would agree that science is the best way of understanding the observable world at any level, from the microscopic to the cosmological scale. And therefore, science produces a form of evidence that no other knowledge system does. And so, in the absence of understanding reality, which is what science is fundamentally trying to understand, you're left with bias, political opinion, public opinion, ideology as the only basis of making decisions. And so, at the end of the day, the absence of robust evidence to policy mechanisms leads to bizarre outcomes that I think in the long run can benefit no nation state.
Could you share one or two examples at either national or global level where scientific evidence genuinely helped shape better policy outcomes?
Well, again, you can look at it at two scales, local and domestic or global. I mean, most famous examples globally would be things like the Montreal Protocol, which dealt with the fluorocarbons in the ozone layer. A classic example where science identified a problem, identified a solution, and the policymakers responded very well to that. And so that's a very good example. There's many examples at domestic level. In New Zealand, for example, science totally changed the ways in which we manage certain risks of contamination in houses from drug abuse. So I won't go into the details for this audience, but there was a lot of methamphetamine contamination, and ridiculous rules were in place which led to a lot of cost for landowners, and they could be reduced by using scientific evidence.
In that context, what can scientists and policymakers realistically do to ensure that major scientific advances actually benefit societies more broadly, rather than reinforcing existing inequalities, both between countries and within them?
Well, you're actually asking a complex question about power structures, about geopolitics. There's not one internet. There's different technopoles around the world, at least three major ones: the Chinese, the American, the European, and others emerging. They all have a different basis to how they perceive the internet and social media. In the current climate, it's in many ways the role of the non-state actor, the major companies, at least in the Western model, complicate the matter extraordinarily. So the tension between the non-state actor, which were largely American, and how different administrations look at it, have obviously led to a failure to reach practical solutions. And the issues of equity, of principles, they've been repeated at every level in every government: the White House, under the previous administration, OECD, UNESCO, United Nations itself. We see the United Nations is trying now to put a finger in the dike around AI. It's actually very hard because the pace of technology moves so fast. The actors are to a certain extent beyond jurisdictional control. And so we have a real conundrum. We all know that the history of humankind is that every technology has an upside and downside. Every technology can be used for good things and bad things, and has been used for good things and bad things. nuclear science can produce nuclear weapons, but it can also produce nuclear medicine, So I think the issue is that the speed of these developments, a large number of them happening primarily out of clean jurisdictional control in the private sector, has meant that the policy community has not got the tools to deal with rapid technological developments. In some areas, we may be able to do it. In synthetic biology, it might be easier because there's a certain set of guidelines that might be applied. Jury's out on that. Quantum, it's unclear because, again, the relationship between security, defence, economic power, all will dominate. And of course, it does. You've been talking about inequality at the global level, but it's inequality and inequities will occur within countries as well. This is a very difficult time, and somebody will look back at this in the benefit of hindsight and say, could we have adapted better? Probably we could have if we had listened to some of and a more risk-taking approach right at the beginning of these technologies. But once they had merged and moved as fast as they had, it's very hard to see, other than we have to adapt and work out how we adapt, acknowledging that this is probably the biggest shift in the human condition since the invention of agriculture. Some people would say that's an overstatement, but I actually believe the emergence of this virtual dimension where blurring of reality and non-reality is now far greater, it's a very deep impact on the human condition. And I think it's quite frightening. There are people it's all great hope, others who are fearful. I'm a pragmatist, and I think we just have to work our way as much as we can in the real world through these issues. And I don't pretend it's going to be easy, but I also am not sure that it's going to be as catastrophic as some people have argued it will be.
I assume we just have to wait and see. But as you said, most technologies do have positives and negatives.
I can't think of one technology that doesn't have a negative.
I completely agree with that. I mean, we've seen that a lot with the debates when it comes to genetic engineering. We've been having these debates for years and years, so different people.
But I mean, ever since human beings invented fire, it's been used for good and for bad. The spear was used for hunting, for food, also used to kill each other. So, I mean, you can map the history of humankind against the background of technologies and both adapting to the technologies, using them well and using them poorly. Now, with the benefit of hindsight, we can make judgments about each one of those developments, but it's actually a very tricky business, technological history.
Yes, no, I completely agree with that. And I see what you say about inclusion on a global level being a quite challenging concept because it's very hard to keep everyone at the same speed when it comes.
Well, I think it's even more difficult than that, and that is science, economics, security, and power have always been connected, but they're more connected now than ever before in the digital world. And that changes the way that policymakers in every country are looking at these technologies. They want the economic benefits of the technologies, which are very attractive to virtually every policymaker, and they're taking that into account. And I guess that's true even in an autocratic country as well. So I think we need to think and understand that if we do not have a good regulatory regimes anywhere in the world for dealing with rapidly emerging technologies, and that's been a challenge which I've been involved in discussions in recent years about, nobody's really got on top of that.
Do you believe trust in science is weakening today? And if so, what do you see as the main drivers behind that shift?
There's different layers to that. There's science as an institution, there's science as a knowledge system, there's the scientists as individuals, and there's the use of scientific knowledge. Mm-hmm. And all of those are different, and we tend to blur these comments. So I think, by and large, scientists have been one of the most trusted institutions, at least in the Western world, compared to, say, governments, media, justice systems, etc., etc. Repeatedly, it's a very high trust system. science itself, of course, has a lot of mechanisms to try and maintain trustworthy knowledge being appearing. So all the ethics of science, all the replication, of course, it breaks down, but in general, there's a lot of science is a self-correcting system. The biggest issues are around the use of science. And that's where it gets messy, because you can selectively use science. You might support the science of climate change, but you might not support the science of genetic modification, for example. You might support the science of genetic modification, but be a person who wants to deny climate change or vaccines. There's lots of complications in this. And then you have people, a relatively small number of people, at least in the West, in the developed world, in the democratic world, who would argue that science should not be on a pedestal, and therefore their knowledge system is as good. Why should science be given a position of authority? Now, that's a small number of people, probably less than 5-10% in any population, but they can be a very noisy part of the population in the populist community. One of the problems we have is the use of science immediately comes up against judgments which are not scientific but are equally important, values judgments, ethical judgments, etc., etc. So I think where we get into trouble is when science blurs those different meanings. I think the issue where it leads to is how do we maintain trustworthy science on one side? And I think by and large, the scientific community has been doing that pretty well, although the emergence of predatory journals and AI-driven publications may be disturbing the peace, so to speak, at the present time. But I think the issues which Robert Merton wrote about in 1942 about scientific communication are still valid today. Scientists, as much as they pretend that they're better, still largely communicate from the altar of truth rather than in a transdisciplinary, engaged way. You know, how many times will you see in a paper some minor molecular biological finding is claimed this is the route to curing all cancer or Alzheimer's disease or whatever. And the public rightly gets sceptical of hyperbole and claim. Now, often that's not the fault of the scientist, it's the fault of the media or the fault of the institution PR thing, but it's an issue. And scientists do overclaim, and I think we saw in COVID a number of times when scientists were grandstanding, and it undermines trust in science. But at the end of the day, the perception of science, particularly in the more values-laden controversial areas, is very much related to the cognitive biases of the individual receiving the message.
For young scientists who want to become stronger communicators, what do you think matters most? Is it interdisciplinary training, exposure beyond academia, engagement with the institutions, or something deeper in how scientists learn to communicate?
Well, that's a very personal question to the individual involved, and I think it's hard to generalize. But I think my lesson would be whatever a young scientist wants to do, they should have in-depth disciplinary expertise in something, because it gives them credibility if they then move off to policy or to communication or something else. I think if they don't have some in-depth expertise, at the end of the day, their ability their perceived abilities may be limited. And so I still think everybody should have an in-depth training in some discipline, doesn't matter whether it's social science or natural science. I think interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary training is largely a matter of experience at the postgraduate level rather than at the undergraduate level. And I think people who think that their skill set is not for academia, not for industry, which is the other major route, but see their role in public policy or communications, then need to step into that world and get familiar with that culture, because at the end of the day, being a good science policy person means understanding the culture of science and the culture of policy equally, if you're any other kind of boundary spanning individual, you need similarly to be able to be an expert. If you don't understand journalism, it's very hard to be a very good science communicator. And equally, there are people who come at science on the other side. I mean, I've seen some of the best communicators of science have come from the communication side the other way. So I mean, I don't want any of your listeners to see that there's a magic solution. There isn't. It depends on your context, your culture, your ambition, and the opportunities. But I think, first and foremost, be sure that you understand science.
If you were starting your career again, knowing that it would eventually lead you to the science policy interface, is there anything you would prioritize differently in terms of skills, experience, or choices?
Look, I've turned out all right, I think. I'm not sure I could say I could do it better than doing it another way. And, I came from a small country where the opportunities evolved in a certain different, and again, country size and the state. I mean, I'm in a small advanced economy. New Zealand is only 5 million people, but it's an advanced economy. So, that's very different to if you're in a large, less developed country or in a different culture. So, I mean, I think, do I have anything I'd do differently in the scientific sense? Perhaps yes, but not in the sense of what I do.
And if you could do it all over again, you would still choose to work at this lovely interface of science and policy then?
Yeah, but remember, I spent 30 years as a scientist first.
Yes.
And yes, my science evolved in that time very much from traditional medical science and developmental physiology into evolutionary biology and other domains. But I was a scientist with some administrative responsibilities as Dean of a medical school and then head of a medical research institute for over 35 years before I moved to policy. So, I mean, I think, I think, again, you can't plan your careers. If you plan your careers, you end up in a rut. You take opportunities when they come in front of you. And I've been lucky. There's been opportunities that came to me when I was a young medical graduate. I didn't think I'd go into medical research, but I ended up by happenstance getting into it. I moved from that into more experimental science. I moved from, and so on and so on. I never set out to be an administrator, but I was asked to do it. And that led to another thing. Then a prime minister asked me to be a science advisor. It went on. And, you've got to make, like in anything in life, you have points when you have choices. And you've got to weigh up why. And, I've chosen my path at a number of inflection points, not overthinking them. And I think too many of people of your generation overthink their destiny. And I think that, I'm a person who has never really planned my path. It's come as opportunities arose. And I think I say to people who are much younger than me, don't overplan it. Because if you overplan it, you may miss opportunity.
What advice would you give to the next generation of scientists who want not only to produce knowledge, but also to help shape public decisions in meaningful ways?
Look, I think at the end of the day, science is going through a bit of a rough patch at the moment. The geopolitical situation and the global financial situation in many countries is making it hard for science. But whether you're a natural scientist or a social scientist or a data scientist, it doesn't really matter. The opportunities to make a difference, both in deeper knowledge for those who want to stay in the laboratory and to make a difference in society, those who are more interested in translational activity, be it in communication or public policy or diplomacy, the opportunities will be there. Yes, it will be at times a bit uncertain. It is a bit of a rough time at the moment. But at the end of the day, the human condition is based on understanding the world we know better and better and better. And so as science is the major way, in fact, the best way to understand the world, at least the observable world, then every bit of science, good science, ultimately will improve the human condition, either directly or indirectly. And I think that we should accept that everything in science is about building a big brick wall, which is one more brick on a wall, which will never get to the top. And, you know, every one of you young scientists will think this is the most important thing you will do with a new discovery. And then 10 years later, you'll say, oh, that was that, and now I'll make another one. And we keep on adding a brick to a wall every time we do a good scientific experiment or we communicate that experiment to the public or to the policymaker. And I'm optimistic. We've talked about some hard issues like AI and other rapidly moving technologies. But at the end of the day, I think that science and social science will play an increasingly important role alongside the natural sciences in making sure that the human condition and the planetary condition do improve, even though we're going through a period of relatively short-term thinking at the present time.
Sir Peter, thank you very much for this insightful conversation and for sharing your perspective on science, policy, and leadership in a rapidly changing world.
My pleasure.
And thank you to our listeners for joining us for this episode of the Global Network for Science and Diplomacy podcast.